Welcome to Australian Fairy Tales, the podcast. The Australian Fairy Tale Society delights in taking a deep dive through time, culture and language to explore fairy tales from an Australian perspective to discover what flesh they wear today. Through this podcast, you'll meet some of our fairy tale enthusiasts. G'day, I'm your host, Annie Stewart, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Faith Mudge today. But first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders past, present and emerging of the land on which I stand, which is that of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our listeners stand and extend a welcome to you and those of your country. And Faith, if I could ask you where you are today.
Well, I'm in one of the suburbs outside Brisbane. It is a beautiful afternoon outside, and just outside my window I can see sunflowers, so very beautiful.
And is it the Yagara and Turrbal people as well, where you are?
You can bear. You
can bear, okay.
Yeah.
So I've got a little blurb here about you for the conference and the theme you're running with. So you're an Australian writer of speculative fiction, and your work has been shortlisted for Ditmar and Aurealis Awards, while her story January Days was runner-up for the Queensland Young Writers Award in 2015. You blog about all things fairy tale, folklore and mythology at beyondthedreamline.wordpress.com, and that'll be on our website. People can check in, and you'd rather be reading than doing anything else.
Yeah, pretty much. That's me.
So thank you and welcome. So have you always been a Brisbane girl, or just out of Brisbane? Is this where you're from?
Most of my life, yes. Yeah, as long as I can remember, really. But my family come from England, and so there's a background of a lot of English folklore, a lot of English history. So that definitely influences what fairy tales I've been interested in. But I love fairy tales from all over the world. One of the things that I love about fairy tales is that there seems to be like connections all over the world. People tell stories about very similar things, which is rather beautiful.
And how did it all start for you then? Can you think back to that little girl and what inspired her love of fairy tales?
Well, I think my family are all book people. I grew up surrounded by books. There's a photo of me aged about 1 with a giant dictionary in my hands, and about the same age, a book of fairy tales. So pretty much from the word go, I think. I remember being read fairy tales when I was when I was very little. My older sister loved the Ruth Manning Sanders Book of Witches. And so that's one that I remember hearing when I was very young. And my mother loves fairy tales too. So I'm sure many fairy tales were read to me then. One of the first fairy tale retellings that I remember is a book that I believe is called Rumpelstiltskin's Daughter. And it's a take on the story of Rumpelstiltskin. If the miller's daughter married Rumpelstiltskin, ran off with him, had a daughter who then tried to fix all the problems that the king had caused to the kingdom with his obsession with gold. And it is a wonderful retelling. I highly recommend it if you can find it. Another one is, and I actually have a copy here, The Practical Princess and Other Liberating Fairy Tales by J. Williams. It is a collection of short stories that are, I would say, more inspired by fairy tales, really, than direct retellings. But they are hilarious and very inventive and absolutely caught my imagination when I was little. So I would say it mostly started there. But yeah, pretty much from the word go, I've always loved fairy tales. When my brother and sister were a bit younger, we used to create books together. And I can't remember exactly how old I was, maybe about 9 or 10. I was suggesting a theme of fairy tales for a thing we were making. And it was, oh no, not fairy tales again. So clearly up until that point, I've been suggesting fairy tales again and again and again, and I haven't changed that much.
And so you had a look around about your faith and dipped into a few things. So you seem to have had your fingers in a lot of pies or a lot of interest around the fairy tale themes on your blog. I read things, but you've done a project on Scheherazade. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was me wanting to work my way through the 1001 Nights. And I didn't end up going all the way through. I was fascinated with what I read. It's an incredibly rich vein of storytelling with all the stories woven into one another, but they are quite brutal and they were taking a little bit of a toll. The violence towards women in those stories was quite difficult to continue, not just reading, but writing about. But there are some extraordinary women in those stories, absolutely amazing characters. And I would like to go back to it sometime. But yeah, I ended up moving on to a different blog project. There's always a possibility I'll go back to that one though.
Whose version were you reading, Faith?
I think I ended up reading a couple, but the one I was leaning on the most was, I think, the Malcolm C. Lyons one.
Okay. Another one I like the sound of, Ladies of Legend.
Yes. As you can see, there's probably a bit of a theme there. I'm very interested in female characters from myth, legend, and folklore. So that one was exploring female characters from various famous legends and some not so famous. That's always been a bit of a passion of mine, and it can be quite surprising. One of the characters who I think maybe gets some unfair treatment is Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian legends. And something that I always tell people, whether they want to hear it or not, is that she is surrounded by women. She is a character surrounded by women. She has a little group of sorceress friends who hang out with her. And that's not something that I heard of until I was reading Le Morte d'Arthur. And I was like, why has no one ever leaned into this? I've always seen her pictured as this kind of solitary figure, but she's not. And that's actually the case with a lot of female figures of legend. They're kind of treated as solitary, as separate from one another, but there's often a background of their mother to another famous figure, or they are surrounded by friends, or they have a nemesis who is also a woman. And I just find that fascinating, the relationships between these women in legend. And that's something I wanted to explore in the blog project.
Who is some of the other ladies of legend?
It was a while ago I did it now. Let me think. Morgan Le Fay, Guinevere. I think I might have done Arthur's mother, Igraine. Circe. Pretty much the famous figures that everyone knows about, but maybe doesn't know a huge amount about, and who I feel maybe get some unfair treatment. I definitely feel that way about Guinevere. I am a passionate defender of Guinevere. I feel that the blame for the fall of Camelot definitely does not lie on her shoulders. And I ended up doing another project on Arthurian legend, where I went into that in a little bit more detail, because yeah, I do love the ladies of Arthurian legend. But there were also women from Greek myth, from Welsh mythology. Yeah, I think there might have been one from Indian mythology. Yeah, quite a few.
And you sort of have feminism as a background to your story.
Yes.
So how did
yes, very much so.
Something I read about you on one of your things, I can't think where I read it, but just that some of the day-to-day tasks of the women doesn't mean that they're subjugated, but, you know, it is just part of their life, sort of.
Absolutely. Someone has to do all the work of running life. And a lot of that has fallen on women over history. And that's something that, instead of disregarding it, we should appreciate it, because it was women who made the sails for the ships that took people off to explore the world. It was women who made sure that people were fed and that the children were cared for and that stories were passed on. And while we should absolutely have choice, I think that we should appreciate all that work that went into getting us here. And I love the variety of female figures in fairy tales, in folklore. Some are very grand figures, queens and fairies and sorceresses, and some are more humble figures. I love Fair Janet, whose great claim to fame was that she managed to hold on to her lover while he was transforming into various terrible shapes. She just held on. And that simplicity, that determination, that stubbornness, I think is absolutely wonderful.
I read somewhere you were thinking of doing a queer version of that. Did you get onto that story?
Still working on it. Still working on it. Doing a second draft at the moment, actually. So we'll see if I can find a publisher for it.
Sorry, I think you're referring to Tamlin, which is a story that was one of the first I learned to tell orally, just because she was the hero. I went, yes, girl power. I think I'll have to.
Oh, isn't she wonderful?
Tell the story. Have you been over to the UK, if that's your background?
No, I haven't. I'm not a huge traveller in general, to be honest. I like to do my travelling through books. But yeah, I have a lot of family over there, and I love a lot of the fairy tales and folklore from over there. That's a big part of my folklore library.
Well, I've been lucky enough to travel there, done most of the big festivals. But the Crick Crack Club, have you heard of them?
No, I haven't.
They are the best storytellers, and they do adult fairy tales. When we meet at the conference, I'll give you the details and you can have a look, because they just do wonderful stuff. And as I was reading all of your things, it made me think of you and tell you about the Crick Crack Club.
That sounds really interesting. I would love to know more about that.
Because the piece you're doing for the conference is Spinning Sideways, the art of the fairy tale retelling. And Crick Crack, one of the stories you mentioned somewhere was the snake leaves.
Mm-hmm.
So Crick Crack, I saw them do that as a show, you know.
That sounds great.
It is really very good. So you have delved into a lot, but when you see the way they put stories together, and I don't.
And oral telling is always so different.
Yeah. I don't want.
That sounds wonderful.
Give us too much of what you're doing, but your session's called Spinning Sideways, the art of the fairy tale retelling. So what will you be doing on the day?
Well, I'll be giving a talk on the art of fairy tale retelling. What interests me is what fairy tales we retell, how we retell them, how they are reinvented, reimagined and retold, what gets kept, what gets rejected and what gets changed. I will be going through the works of 3 Australian writers who have retold fairy tales and talk about the kind of changes they've made, what they've decided to keep, how the structure of the fairy tale has informed their stories. It's really just an excuse to reread some fairy tale retellings. But yeah, it's a subject that's very close to my heart. I've written a number of fairy tale retellings. Even when I don't intend to, I find myself writing fairy tale retellings, and I read a lot of fairy tale retellings. So it kind of fascinates me what we do with the art of the fairy tale, with the structure of the fairy tale. We don't, as a society, we don't seem able to stay away from it. From Disney to theatre, to novels and short stories, to music. There's fairy tales in everything. And I think part of the reason that keeps happening is because it is such a perfect structure. Fairy tales have a beautiful narrative cohesion and these amazing motifs in them. And they've got a wonderful history to them as well. So we keep coming back to them, but every time we do, they are different. Everyone's got their own different interpretation.
Is there any of a pattern in the stories that are retold, or they're all different?
Well, there are fairy tales that everyone knows, and so they get retold much more often than others. So Cinderella, Snow White, Rapunzel, the big names, the Disney names, if you like, because that's, I think, how a lot of people get introduced to them. there are other ones like the 12 Dancing Princesses that I've seen quite a lot of versions of. There's an absolutely amazing retelling of Rumpelstiltskin by Naomi Novik called Spinning Silver, which is an extraordinary retelling. As for whether there's a lot of similarities, I don't know. What interests me is the differences. I think there is maybe a tendency in modern fairy tale retellings to kind of reject a lot of the original trappings of domesticity, maybe, and to have very much action roles for the female heroes, which I think that maybe there are more fairy tales that do that. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that Cinderella needs a little bit of help to get out of her bad situation. We all need help sometimes. And I don't think that's something to be ashamed of. There's lots of people in her situation. And the fact that she can handle her situation with such kindness and such resolve is, I think, something quite admirable. There are fairy tales that have more action hero type characters, and I would love to see retellings of those and see what people do with them. I would love to see more retellings of Tam Lin. There are a few out there that are absolutely amazing. And so I think it's one of those stories that can really handle a lot more retellings. I'm very interested in retellings of the 12 Dancing Princesses because it's one I've written myself. And so obviously one I'm very fond of. And those ones, there's a really interesting range of takes on what the princes mean. Whether they're there as in my version they're kind of trapped, in other versions they're quite sinister, in some it's very much as it appears, they're just in their own realm. And there's very different takes on the king as well, whether he's someone trying to help his daughters or someone quite sinister himself. And that's what I love about fairy tale retellings. I love how there's an infinite number of takes you can have, an infinite number of reinterpretations. You can look through someone's eyes and see that story as something brand new, no matter how old it is.
Are you ever kind of disappointed with, say, a Disney that took The Little Mermaid and changed it so much in the end? Because, you know, part of the whole written story of Grimm's is every step was like, and
yeah, I like their version of The Little Mermaid, actually, in a lot of ways. I like how hopeful it is.
Yeah.
The one I'm really offended by is Frozen. It's got beautiful music, but it is not the original story in any way, shape, or form.
No.
And I love the original story of the Snow Queen.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of characters in it that I love that obviously do not make it into the movie. I don't know where any of the original Snow Queen actually comes into Frozen, because it's pretty much its own thing. They just went, okay, there's a girl who can make snow, and called it a day.
There's a lot of Nordic mythology in it as well, isn't there?
It's a wonderfully deep story.
Yeah.
You can keep going back to it. It's a wonderful quest narrative. And it's a story that really values female relationships. Again, there are wonderful scenes in that story with the witch and her garden and how she does not want Gerda to leave. It's not cruel, but it's a kind of desperate loneliness. And the wise women and the robber girl. And I would have loved to have seen a movie which featured all those characters, but Frozen was not it. they had trolls instead, talking trolls. So yes, I think that Disney retellings, there's no actual harm in the changes that they make, except they reach so wide that it kind of tamps down on other people's creativity, because they see that and they don't know a lot about the original story. So that's where I find Disney retelling sometimes a little frustrating. But I don't mind the changes. I think that when you tell a story to a child, it's always going to be a little bit different from the story that is in your heart. So you create something different. I work with children, and I once ended up telling the story of Baba Yaga to a little girl who was about 4. And I didn't want her thinking about witches who ate children. But I did want to share some of the magic of the story with her. And so we ended up really focusing on the house with the chicken legs. And she ended up drawing this beautiful little picture of a house with chicken legs and talking to me about that story for quite some time afterwards. And yeah, that's something that as a memory I treasure. So the real thing with Disney is that it's sanitized stories that spread a really long way. So instead of it being something a bit more manageable that people know both, they just know the Disney version.
So up here in Queensland, I told you before, I'm brand new up here. Was there any Indigenous mythology up here that you sort of were drawn to that had that sort of fairy tale feel or special feel of a bit of mystical?
Yes, I have read some collections. The collections I've read are older, and so they don't really, it's not local.
Yes.
It's more sort of spread out across Australia. Mm-hmm. I would love to read more collections of local folklore. There was one story that I think, I can't remember what blog project I covered it in. And I can't remember the exact title. It's about these 2 men who build a tower, and they're doing it, I seem to recall, to impress this girl. I don't know how impressed she actually was, but they built this incredibly tall tower. I think it was called the Black Tower, and it ended up, I think it ended up offending some spirit, and the tower came crashing down and caused a massive amount of destruction. And I was actually fascinated by that, because the image of the tower is something that seems to just be spread across the whole world in terms of fairy tales. That's something that just seems to fascinate everybody. And there's this poor girl standing in the background going, why are they building me a tower? So yeah, that's something that it's that cohesive human spirit of these are the things we love telling stories about. We love telling stories about love and about fear and about weird towers and about flowers and about the animals in the landscape that interest us and that seem to have a sort of mystery to them. There's so many things that you can just recognize, oh, that's worth telling a story about. And everyone's done it all over the world. So that's something that I really love.
So your blog, Beyond the Dreamline, is there anything I should know about that, the Dreamline?
Well, there's not a really very exciting story behind that. A very long time ago, that was going to be the title for an anthology. And then it didn't end up being that, but I really loved the idea of the Dreamline. The idea of there being this sort of nebulous space where stories come from and where that creativity zone is. So I've ended up using it quite a bit online, just because I did not want to let that particular phrase go.
So what is speculative fiction, which you've done really well in and written quite a bit about? What is that? Can you explain that to us?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
Yeah.
But really, it's fiction that takes a step away from the ordinary world and looks elsewhere. That might mean any number of things. It's an incredibly broad umbrella, and that's something I love about it, actually. It might mean magic realism. It might mean dark fantasy. It might mean high fantasy. It might mean something like The Lord of the Rings, or it might mean something like Twilight. It just covers this enormous span of creativity, of thinking, well, what if? And it's my comfort zone as a writer, as a storyteller. That's where I always end up coming back to. Even when I'm trying to write something else, it always ends up creeping in somewhere. But yeah, that's what I tend to read as well. speculative fiction is a wonderful creative space that has space for everyone, I think.
And does the fairy tales inform that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. As I said, I've written a number of fairy tale retellings, and that I've read a lot of fairy tale retellings. I think that fairy tales have such a beautiful shape to them, and all these beautiful motifs that you keep returning to. I know that I can't look at roses without thinking about Sleeping Beauty, and I can't think about ravens. I can't see ravens or crows without thinking about the very many stories about those birds. Fairy tales kind of color the way that I look at the world. They encourage me to see a bit of magic everywhere.
Well, you sound like a session we need to go to. You're passionate about fairy tales.
Thank you.
No, I've got it here just to remind people. Spinning Sideways, the art of fairy tale retelling. That'll be your session. But our annual conference will consider the theme Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil. So you obviously applied. What drew you to the theme, Faith?
Well, flesh or fossil, it's really about old stories and new reinventions. And that's something obviously that is very dear to me. It's what attracts me to fairy tales. And so it seemed the perfect theme for me, actually. And the perfect theme for what I want to talk about, which is reinventions, reimaginings, rediscoveries. So I cannot wait to hear what everyone else has to say and everyone else's ideas.
And so many different people will contribute. I'm sure there's things you're going to be dipping into all weekend.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so excited. I can't wait.
It will be lovely. Well, I look forward to meeting you, and just want to thank Faith Mudge for coming along. Where is the surname Mudge from? Do you know the meaning of it? It's quite unusual.
I don't know the exact meaning of it. I don't think it's anything terribly exciting. I think it's something to do with marshes. It's an English name.
Oh, from the marshes or something like that.
I think something like that. Yes.
Okay, there you go. Well, once again, thank you very much. I'm your podcast host, Annie Stewart, and we've been talking to Faith Mudge, who's going to be doing a fabulous session. Now, all fairy tale enthusiasts are welcome to attend a fairy tale ring, either online or in their state, and or to attend the Brisbane conference on October the 1st to the 2nd, 2022. There we'll be exploring the question, fairy tales, flesh or fossil. To learn more, visit AustralianFairyTaleSociety.org, or our social media tag is @AustralianFairyTales. Once again, thanks, Faith, and I look forward to meeting you at the conference.
Thank you very much. Same. I can't wait.